Foreword by Norman Dodge. Rules? More rules? Really, isn't life complicated enough? Isn't it constraining enough, even without abstract rules that don't take into account the specifics of our circumstances? Given that our brains are plastic and develop differently depending on our life experience, how do we know that additional rules will be useful? People don't want rules. Even in the Bible, when Moses came down from the mountain after a long absence, carrying the tablets of the Ten Commandments, he saw that the children of Israel had gone wild. They had been slaves to Pharaoh and had been subject to his tyrannical laws for 400 years. And then Moses put them through severe trials in the wilderness for 40 more years to cleanse them of their slave habits. Now that they were finally free, they were overcome by intemperance. They lost control of themselves, danced around the idol of the golden calf, and committed all kinds of defilement of the flesh. I have good news. And bad news, the legislator called out to them. Which would you prefer? Would you like to hear first? The good news, the hedonists replied, I have convinced him to reduce the number of commandments from 15 to 10. Hallelujah, the restless crowd shouted. And the bad one. Adultery is still a sin, so there will be rules, but please, not too many. We don't like rules even when we know they help us, even when we know that they help us. If our souls are alive, if we have characters, the rules seem like oppression, something inimical to our sense of autonomy and pride in being able to order our own lives. Why should we be judged by someone else's rules? And yet we are. After all, God did not give Moses the 10 Commandments, but the commandments. Teen 1, if I am a free being, then my first reaction to someone's orders may well be that no one, not even God himself, dare not tell me what to do, even if it is for my good. But the story of the golden calf also teaches us that without rules, we quickly become slaves to our own passions. And there is no freedom in that. There is no freedom in that. The story also has another message without a guide. Left to live at our own discretion, we tend to seek the easy and glorify that which is beneath us in this case. A man-made idol in the form of a man-made idol, in the form of an animal that awakens our animal instincts and does not in any way and does nothing to organize them. Old Jewish history clearly shows that ancient people thought about what the prospects for our civilization could be, the prospects of our civilized behavior in the absence of rules, that is, what would raise our views and standards to something higher. The good thing about the biblical story is that it doesn't just list rules as lawyers, deputies, or administrators, lawyers, politicians, or administrators do. It wraps them in dramatic narratives that clearly show why the rules are needed. This makes them easier to understand. In the same way, in this book, Professor Peterson does not just offer his 12 rules, but also tells stories. Through his knowledge of many fields, he illustrates and explains why the best rules do not actually limit us, but rather further our goals and make life fuller and freer. I first met Jordan Peterson on September 12th, 2004 at the home of our mutual friends, the TV producer Wojtek Szymberg and the general practitioner Esther Becker. It was a party dedicated to Wojtek's people. Wojtek and Estera are Polish immigrants who grew up in the Soviet Empire, where it was common to keep many topics quiet. Anyone who was careless enough to speak out about certain social arrangements or philosophical ideas, not to mention the regime itself, risked getting into a lot of trouble. Now, the hosts enjoyed relaxed, sincere conversations at elegant gatherings where you could say what you really thought without any restrictions. The speak your mind rule was in effect here. When it came to politics, people of different beliefs talked to each other and even looked forward to it, which is becoming less and less common. Sometimes Wojtek's own thoughts or truths would burst out of him with laughter. Then he would hug the person who made him laugh or provoked him to be more open than he intended to be. It was the most luxurious part of those visits. His frankness and warm embrace were worth the provocation. Meanwhile, Esther's voice echoed the room on a well-defined path to its intended audience. The explosions of truth did not make the atmosphere less friendly for the company. On the contrary, they only encouraged greater manifestations of the truth. It made us free. We never stopped joking, and the evening became more and more pleasant as the evening went on. With de-repressive Eastern Europeans like the Schomburg Beckers, you always know who you're dealing with, and this frankness was life-giving. Honoré de Balzac, the writer, describing the balls and parties of his native France, once remarked that one party actually consisted of two. In the first hours, it consisted of bored people who were pretending and posing to look good, and guests who came to meet someone who would confirm their brilliance and status. Later, much later, when most of the guests had left, the second real party would begin. Now, the conversations were among all those present, and the heartfelt jokes replaced the starched dryness. At Esther and Wojtek's parties, such sincere openness and intimacy began as soon as we entered the room. Wojtek is a kind of gray-haired hunter who tirelessly searches for potential people's intellectuals. He knows how to distinguish between someone who can really talk in front of the camera and be sincere at the same time. The camera notices this too. He often invites these kinds of people to these parties. That day, Vodek brought a psychology professor from my home university in Toronto. He made a good call. Mind and emotions are harmoniously combined. Vodek was the first to put Jordan Peterson in front of the camera. He looked like a teacher looking for students because he was always ready to explain. It didn't hurt that Peterson liked the camera and that the friendship was mutual. That afternoon, a table was set for many in the Schönberg-Becker garden. Around them sat the usual array of mouths and ears and virtuoso of the spoken word. We were being annoyed by annoying bees. And then there was this new guest with an Alberta accent and cowboy boots who didn't care and just kept talking. He was talking, and we were playing musical chairs to drive away insects, but at the same time, we tried not to move away from the table because this stranger was surprisingly interesting. He had a strange habit of talking about the deepest issues with anyone sitting at the table, most of whom he was meeting for the first time as if they were idle chatter. Even when he was talking about something unimportant, the gap between how did you meet Wodek and Estera, or I used to be a beekeeper and got used to bees and more serious topics, was only a fraction of a second. Discussions of such issues can be heard at parties where professors and specialists gather, but usually the conversation remains between two specialists in a particular field who are tucked away into a corner somewhere. If someone does talk about this for the general public, it is mostly motivated by a desire to show off. But this Peterson, despite his erudition, did not give the impression of a man of ostentatious scholarship. He had the enthusiasm of a child who had learned something new and just couldn't help but share it. He seemed to be like a child who believed that if he found something interesting to him, it might be interesting to others. There was something boyish about the cowboy. Well, at least in the fact that he brought up touchy subjects as if we had all grown up together in the same village or even in the same family and had long been thinking about the same problems of human existence. Peterson was not an eccentric. He had enough features of an ordinary person, was a Harvard professor, a gentleman as much as a cowboy can be, but he often swore in a hillbilly way, as if in the 1950s. But everyone listened with great interest because he really touched on the issues that concerned everyone present. There was something liberating about being around someone so educated, but who spoke without bills. His thinking was motoric. He seemed to be compelled to think out loud, to use his speech apparatus for mental activity. To take off. Not manically, but his usual speed was high. Inspired thoughts just kept jumping out. But unlike many academics who would climb up on a pedestal and try to stay there, he liked it when someone corrected him or challenged him. He didn't stand on end. In such circumstances, he would say, "Hey, hey." In a vernacular way, shake his head in passing, shake it if he made a mistake, and laugh at himself for making a simplistic judgment. He appreciated being shown the other side of an issue. Dialogue was his main way of thinking about a problem. Another thing that is surprising about him is that for an egghead, Peterson is surprisingly practical. Almost all of his examples are from everyday life business management, making furniture, much of which he made himself, designing a simple house, turning a room into a dollhouse, which has already become an internet meme. In another specific case related to education, he created an online writing project that kept minority students from dropping out of school. They were assigned a psychoanalytic exercise in which they freely made associations with their past, present, and future, now called the self-authoring program. I've always admired people from the Midwest who grew up on farms or in very small towns in the middle of the prairie. These people were used to hard work, knew how to make things with their own hands, spent a lot of time outside, became close to nature, often got their own education, and went to universities against all odds. In my opinion, they are not at all like the more sophisticated but lacking in naturalness urbanites who were destined for higher education from the beginning. Because of this, they sometimes take it for granted or do not consider it to be of particular value, but just another step on the career ladder. Those Westerners were different, independent, unassuming, straightforward, sociable, and not as timid as their urban counterparts who spend too much time at home manipulating symbols on the computer. This cowboy was only concerned with a certain opinion if it could somehow help someone. We became friends. As a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and lover of literature, he aroused my sympathy because he was a well-read practitioner who not only loved philosophy, ancient mythology, and soulful Russian novels, but treated these things as the most valuable treasures. He also conducted statistical research on personality and temperament and studied neuroscience. Although he was trained to be a behavioral specialist, he was drawn to psychoanalysis, focusing on dreams, archetypes, and conflicts rooted in childhood, and was also interested in the role of defense and rationalization in everyday life. He was also distinguished from others by the fact that he was the only member of the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto who did not leave clinical practice. During my visits, our conversations began with light chatter and laughter as he welcomed a guest to his home. This was the Peterson, a hillbilly from the Alberta backwoods who grew up watching the movie Foreword. Peterson and his wife Tammy literally gutted their house from the inside out. They turned it into one of the most interesting and stunning middle-class homes I've ever seen. They had paintings, some carved masks, abstract portraits, but all of this paled against a huge collection of original socialist realist paintings with images of Lenin and early communists commissioned by the USSR. Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, when most of the world breathed a sigh of relief, Peterson began buying up this propaganda on the internet. Paintings glorifying the Soviet revolutionary spirit completely filled every wall, ceiling, and even the bathrooms. This was not because Jordan had any sympathy for totalitarianism. He wanted to remind himself of what he and the rest of the world would rather forget, that millions of people were slaughtered for the sake of utopia. It was hard to get used to this house decorated with delusions that almost destroyed humanity. However, the perception of all this was not so offensive thanks to his beautiful and unique wife, Tama. She fully embraced the exotic attributes herself and even encouraged others to express themselves in such an unusual way. Those paintings provided visitors with the first window through which Jordan's concern with man's ability to do evil in the name of good, the psychological riddle of self-deception, unfolded. How can a person deceive himself and not see it? We shared an interest in this phenomenon. In addition, we spent many hours discussing what I would call a lesser problem lesser, because it is not so widespread, the human ability to do evil for the sake of evil, the joy that some people take in the destruction of others. John Milton, the 17th century English poet, expressed this with amazing insight in Paradise Lost. So we talked while drinking tea at Peterson's place in a kitchen that looked like the underworld, with walls lined with that strange collection of paintings. They testified to his sincere desire to move beyond mere ideology, left or right, and not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Over time, there was nothing unusual about those kitchen tea parties, discussions of family affairs, fresh readings, along with all those paintings hanging over us. It was just living in a world that once existed and still exists somewhere else. In his book, Maps of Meaning, the first and only book to come before this one, he shares his profound discoveries in the universal realms of world mythology. He explains how all cultures have created stories to help us struggle against the chaos we are born into and eventually map it. This chaos is everything we don't know, the uncharted lands we have to explore, both in the world around us and within our psyche. It combines evolution, the neuroscience of emotions, the best of Jung, a little Freud, and many of the great works of Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, Eliade, Neumann, Piaget, Fry, and Frankl. Maps of Meaning, published almost 2 decades ago, shows Jordan's broad approach to figuring out how human beings and the human brain cope with the perennial circumstance that arises whenever we encounter the unexplainable. The weight and brilliance of this work is that it shows the roots of the circumstance, which grows out of evolution, our DNA, our brains, and the most ancient lore. Peterson argues that these stories have survived and come down to us precisely because they are still capable of being guides in our encounters with uncertainty and the unknown, which cannot be avoided. One of the many useful functions of the book you are reading is that it marks the entry point to Maps of Meaning, a work incredibly complex because Jordan was honing his approach to psychology as he wrote it. But it was foundational because regardless from differences in genes, life heritage, or how differently our plastic brains have been programmed by experience, We all have to deal with the unknown, and we all try to move from chaos to order. That's why many of the rules in this book, and they are based on maps of meaning, have the power of universality. Maps of Meaning was conceived in Jordan's mind by a searing realization as a teenager during the Cold War. Humanity was on the verge of blowing up an entire planet to protect its diverse identities. He wanted to understand how it was that people were willing to sacrifice everything for some obscure identity. He also sought to understand the ideologies that pushed totalitarian regimes to behave in such a way, killing their own citizens. In Maps of Meaning, and again in this book, he warns and urges readers to beware of ideology no matter who tries to push it, and no matter what the purpose. Ideologies are simple ideas disguised as science or philosophy that seem to explain the complexities of the world and offer solutions that will supposedly make it perfect. Ideologues are people who pretend to know how to make the world a better place. Despite the reign of chaos within themselves, the warrior's guise created by ideology covers this chaos. This is arrogance, of course. And it is also one of the most important themes of this book, Put Your Own House in Order. First, Jordan gives practical advice on how to do this. Ideologies are substitutes for real knowledge, and ideologues are always dangerous when they come to power. Because the approach of limited know-it-alls is not capable of capturing the complexity of existence. Moreover, when their social projects fail, ideologues lay the blame not on themselves, but on everyone who was not fooled by their simplifications. Another prominent professor at the University of Toronto, Louis Foy, in his book Ideology and Ideologues, observed that ideologies reuse the same religious stories they promise to replace, but lose their narrative and psychological fullness. Communism borrowed the story of the children of Israel in Egypt, with its enslaved class, rich oppressors, and a leader like Lenin who travels abroad, lives among the oppressors, and then leads the slaves to the promised land utopia dictatorship of the proletariat. To understand the ideology, Jordan read a lot, not only about the Soviet Gulag, but also about the Holocaust and the rise of Nazism. I had never met anyone who was born a Christian. Not. I was very dissatisfied with the way contemporary political science tried to explain the emergence of Nazism, totalitarianism, and prejudice. This was a significant factor in my decision to underpin my studies of politics with the study of the unconscious, projection, psychoanalysis, and the regressive potential of group psychology, psychiatry, and the brain. Jordan left political science for similar reasons. With such strong common interests, we did not always agree on the answers, and thank God, but we almost always agreed on the questions themselves. Our friendship was by no means depressing and gloomy. I got into the habit of attending the lectures of my fellow professors at our university, at Jordan's lectures, which were always crowded. I had the opportunity to observe what millions of people later saw on the internet, a brilliant and sometimes dazzling speaker whose best speeches resembled the performance of a jazz musician. At times, he looked like a prairie preacher, not in his theology, but in his passion and ability to tell stories that showed vital decisions related to belief or disbelief in certain ideas. At the same time, he moved very easily into an engaging and systematic summary of a series of scientific studies. He was brilliant at helping students become more aware and more understanding of themselves and their future. He taught them to respect the great books written throughout human history. He gave vivid examples from his clinical practice and was within limits open even about his own vulnerabilities. He drew attention to interesting connections between evolution, the brain, and religious stories. In a world where thinkers like Richard Dawkins teach students to think of evolution and religion as opposites, Jordan argued to his students that evolution helps explain the deep psychological appeal and wisdom of many ancient stories from Gilgamesh to the life of Buddha, Egyptian mythology, and the Bible. For example, he showed that stories of voluntary journeys into the unknown of monomyth reflect the universal tasks for which the brain evolved. He respected these stories, did not engage in reductionism, and did not claim to have exhausted their wisdom. When he discussed topics such as prejudice, the related emotions of fear and disgust, or the commonplace differences between the sexes, he was able to show how these qualities evolved and why they survived. Above all, he drew his students' attention to topics that are rarely touched upon in universities. Among them is a simple fact: all the ancients, from Buddha to the authors of the Bible, knew the same thing that every experienced adult knows: that life is suffering. If you or someone close to you is suffering, it's a shame. But in spite of everything, it is nothing special. We don't suffer simply because of stupid politicians or a corrupt system. And not because we, like most people, can always truthfully describe ourselves as victims of something or someone. The real reason is that we were born human, and that alone guarantees us a generous dose of suffering. If you or your loved ones are not suffering now, there is a good chance that you will be in 5 years, unless you are incredibly lucky. Raising children is hard, working is hard, getting old, sick, and dying is hard too. Jordan emphasizes that doing it all alone, without the support of a loved one, without the wisdom, without the psychological advice of the greatest psychologist, is even harder. He did not intimidate the students. On the contrary, his sincere stories seemed to give them confidence, because deep down, most of them knew he was telling the truth. This is despite the fact that they had no platform to discuss such things. Perhaps the adults were so eager to protect them that they fooled themselves into thinking that avoiding talking about suffering would magically prevent it. He also spoke about the myth of the hero. This cross-cultural topic was explored through psychoanalysis by Otto Rank, who noted, following in Freud's footsteps, that heroic myths in different cultures are similar. The same theme was picked up by Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Eric Neumann, and others. Freud made a great contribution to the explanation of the phenomenon of neuroses, in particular by focusing on the so-called story of the loser hero, the one about Oedipus, while Jordan focused on the victorious heroes. In all of these triumphant stories, the hero has to go into the unknown, to uncharted lands, to cope with new great challenges and take great risks. During this time, some part of the hero has to die or be given up so that he can be reborn and meet the challenge. This requires courage, a trait that is rarely mentioned in lectures or psychology textbooks. Recently, he publicly spoke out in favor of freedom of speech and against what I call coercion of speech, when the government forces citizens to voice certain political positions. At that time, the stakes were very high. He knew how much he could lose. Nevertheless, in my eyes, he and TME, for that matter, showed not only courage, but also the ability to live by many of the rules described in this book. And that is not easy. I have seen him grow from an extraordinary person to someone even stronger and more confident thanks to living by these rules. It was the writing of this book, as well as the development of these rules, that prompted him to take a stand against coercion of speech. And that is why during those events, he began to post his thoughts about life and these rules on the internet. Now that he has reached 100 million views on YouTube, we know that he has been heard. Given our aversion to rules, how do we explain this incredible response to his lectures on rules? In Jordan's case, it is undoubtedly his charisma and willingness to stand firm on the principles that initially attracted such widespread attention. The number of views of his first statements on YouTube quickly exceeded hundreds of thousands. But people kept listening because what he was saying met an unspoken deep need. This need is that, despite our desire to be free of rules, we all want order. Nowadays, many young people are hungry for rules, or at least guidelines, for good reason. At least in the West, millennials are experiencing a unique historical circumstance. In my opinion, they are the first generation to have been so thoroughly taught two seemingly opposing ideas about morality. In their schools, colleges, and universities, many of my own generation did this. This contradiction has left them confused and uncertain, without guidance, and more tragically deprived of riches they don't even know exist. The first idea, or strand of the doctrine, is that morality is relative, or at least a personal value judgment. Relative means that nothing is absolutely right or absolutely wrong. Instead, morality and the rules associated with it are merely personal opinions, accidents relative to a certain structure, such as an ethnicity, upbringing, culture, or historical moment in which someone was born. It is no more than an accident of birth. According to this argument, which has already become a credo, history teaches that religions, tribes, nations, and ethnic groups are prone to misunderstandings on certain fundamental issues, and this has always been the case. Today, postmodern leftists claim that someone's morality is solely an attempt to exercise power over another group. When it becomes apparent how arbitrary your and your society's moral values are, it is a good thing to show tolerance to people who think differently and come from different diverse circumstances. The emphasis on tolerance is so strong that many people consider it one of the worst character flaws to be condemnation. And since we cannot distinguish right from wrong, we do not know what is good. The most indecent thing an adult can do is to give life advice to a young person. And so a generation has grown up untrained in what is aptly called practical wisdom that guided previous generations. Millennials are often told that they have received the best education that is possible. In fact, they have suffered from severe intellectual and moral neglect. Many relativists from the generation to which Jordan and I belong became professors of those millennials and set out to devalue thousands of years of human knowledge about virtue. They dismissed it as outdated, as irrelevant, or even oppressive. They have been so successful in this that today even the word virtue itself sounds outdated, and those who use it sound like smug moralists from the last century. However, the study of virtue is somewhat different from the study of morality, right and wrong, good and evil. Aristotle defined virtue simply as the behavior that most effectively leads to happiness in life. And vices are the behaviors that lead to happiness least effectively. He noticed that virtues always tend to balance and avoid extremes, which are followed by vices. Aristotle explored virtues and vices in his Nicomachean Ethics. It was a book based on experience and observations, not assumptions about the happiness available to people. Developing a judgment about the difference between virtue and vice is the beginning of wisdom, and this can never become obsolete. Our modern relativism, on the other hand, begins with the assertion that it is impossible to judge how one should live, because there is no true good, and there are no true virtues because they are also relative. Therefore, in relativism, the closest approximate equivalent of virtue is tolerance. Only tolerance will unite our society, which is divided into different groups, and save us from hurting each other. That's why you are using Facebook and other social media to signal your so-called virtue. You tell everyone how tolerant, open-minded, and compassionate you are, and you wait for the likes to roll in. And this is despite the fact that talking about your own virtues is not a virtue, but self-praise. The virtue signal is not a virtue. It is probably our most common flaw. Intolerance of other people's views, no matter how inconsistent or ignorant, is not just wrong. In a world where there is no right or wrong, it is even worse. It is a sign that you are obscenely lacking in sophistication or could be dangerous. But as it turned out, many people cannot tolerate the vacuum, the chaos that is inherent in life, but made worse by this moral relativism. They cannot live without a moral compass, without an ideal to strive for in life. And for relativists, ideals are also values, and therefore also relative and not worth sacrificing. Along with relativism, nihilism and despair are growing, as well as the opposite of moral relativism, blind certainty promised by ideologies that supposedly have answers to all questions. Following these paths, we come to the second teaching that millennials are bombarded with. They go to a humanities course to study the most important books in human history, but they are not offered books. Instead, they are subjected to ideological assaults based on some terrible simplifications. While the relativist is imbued with uncertainty, the ideologue is the exact opposite. He or she is overly judgmental, intolerant of dissent. They always know what is wrong with the other person and what should be done about it. Sometimes it seems that in a society of relativists, the only one who is willing to give advice is the one who has little to share. Modern moral relativism has numerous sources. As we in the West studied more history, we realized that different eras had different moral codes. As we sailed across the seas and discovered new lands, we learned about the existence of distant tribes on different continents whose moral codes made sense in relation to or within the backstage of their societies. Science has also played a role attacking religious visions of the world, thus blurring the religious ground of ethics and rules. Materialist sociology has hinted that we can divide the world into facts which everyone can see, which are objective and real, and values which are subjective and personal. In this case, we can first agree on the facts, and then perhaps someday develop a scientific code of ethics, which has not happened yet. Moreover, by implying that values are less valid than facts, science has made another contribution to moral relativism, which also considered value as secondary. However, the idea that we can easily distinguish between facts and values remains naive up to a point. Someone's values determine what will be paid attention to and what will be considered a fact. The idea that different societies have different rules and morals was known in the ancient world, and it is interesting to compare their response to this realization with the modern response: relativism, nihilism, and idealism, and ideology. When the ancient Greeks sailed to India and other places, they too found that rules, morals, and customs varied from place to place, and they saw that the explanation of right and wrong stemmed from some kind of hereditary authority. The Greek response was not despair, but a new invention philosophy, responding to the uncertainty which came from the realization that these moral codes did not coincide with local ones. Socrates did not choose to become a nihilist, relativist, or ideologue. Instead, he devoted his life to the search for a wisdom that could come to terms with these differences. In other words, he helped invent philosophy. He spent his life asking perplexing, fundamental questions such as what is virtue, how does a person live a good life, or what is justice? He looked at different approaches, asking which ones seemed most consistent and in line with human nature. I believe that questions of this kind give this book its life. Ancient people were not paralyzed by the discovery that other peoples had different ideas about how to live. It deepened their understanding of humanity and led to some of the most exhaustive conversations ever held between people about how to live. It is similar with Aristotle. Instead of despairing at these differences between moral codes, Aristotle said that although the specific rules, laws, and customs vary from place to place, what does not change is that it is human nature to create these rules, laws, and customs. In modern terms, it seems that all human beings are biologically gifted with some kind of irresistible interest that leads us to create rules wherever we are. The idea that human life can be free of rules is a fantasy. We are rule generators, and given that we are moral animals, what does modern simplistic relativism mean for us? It means that we confuse ourselves by pretending to be something we are not. This is a mask, albeit a strange one, because it fools mainly the one who wears it. Scratch the Mercedes of the smartest postmodernist relativist professor with a key, and you will immediately see how quickly the mask of relativism with its fiction that there is neither right nor wrong will fall off. The vestments of radical tolerance will also fall off. Since we do not yet have an ethic based on modern science, Jordan does not try to write his rules from scratch, disregarding thousands of years of wisdom as if they were mere superstition and ignoring our greatest moral achievements. It would be much more appropriate to incorporate the best of what we are currently learning from books that people have seen fit to preserve for over a millennium, stories that have survived the ravages of time. He does what prudent leaders have always done. He does not claim that human wisdom begins with him, but instead looks to his own leaders first. And while the themes of his book are serious, Jordan partly treats them with a dash of humor, as the chapter titles suggest. He does not claim to have exhaustive knowledge. Some chapters are extensive discussions of our psychology as he understands it. So why not call this book a collection of hints, a much lighter, friendlier, and less hard to the ear expression than rules? Because these are really rules. And the first rule is that you have to take responsibility for your own life. Period. With a generation that has been spoon-fed endlessly by their ideological teachers about rights that belong to them, you would think that this generation would object if someone told them that they should focus on responsibility. In this generation, many grew up in small families with overprotective parents, playgrounds, and padded floors, and then went to universities with safe spaces where they didn't have to hear what they didn't want to hear. They were taught to avoid taking risks, and now there are millions of people among them who are depressed by this underestimation of their potential strength. They were the ones who accepted Jordan's message that each person has a fundamental responsibility, that to live a fulfilling life, one must put one's own house in order and only then think about even greater responsibility. The scale of this reaction often brought us both to tears. Sometimes these rules are demanding. They require you to start a gradual process that will eventually take you to new limits. To do this, as I said, you have to go to the unknown. To take yourself beyond your current self, it is imperative that you carefully choose your ideals and then move toward them, those that are out there, higher than you, better than you, those that are not always certain to be reached. But if we are not sure that our ideals can be achieved, then why try at all? Because if you don't strive for them, one thing is certain: you will never feel that your life has meaning. And also, perhaps because deep down, as strange as it may sound, we all want to be judged. Dr. Norman Dodge is the author of The Brain That Changes Itself.